She stood there, a young queen, once untouchable, now trembling before the blade. Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed England forever, looked toward the crowd one last time. Among them stood a silent witness, a woman named Margaret Dymoke, handpicked by Thomas Cromwell, England's most feared schemer. Her mission wasn't to guard the Queen. It was to watch her. To observe, record, and report every word, every tear, every final breath. As Anne's life ended with one clean stroke, Margaret didn't flinch. History says she showed no emotion, no pity, no disgust, just calm, professional stillness. And then she slept soundly that night, as if nothing had happened. But how does one live with a memory like that? How does a woman spy on another's downfall and carry that silence for 40 years? This isn't a story about kings and crowns, it's about conscience and control. About a spy who watched a queen die in pleasure and fear and found peace in the very thing that destroyed her. So tonight, we open the hidden pages of Tudor England, where loyalty was survival and silence was the sharpest weapon of all. Because behind Anne Boleyn's death was a woman who saw everything and said nothing. Thomas Cromwell was not born into power. He built it, brick by brick, lie by lie. A blacksmith's son turned royal strategist, he understood that information, not lineage, ruled the court. To survive under Henry VIII, you didn't need noble blood, you needed eyes everywhere. Cromwell was the architect of surveillance in Tudor England. Every whisper, every glance, every trembling servant was a possible report. He built a kingdom of secrets, where fear was the crown and truth was a tool. And when Anne Boleyn, the king's second wife, began to fall from grace, Cromwell saw opportunity. Her enemies were plenty. Her friends were silent. What he needed was someone inside her walls, someone invisible. That's where Margaret Dymoke entered history, or rather, slipped quietly into it. A lady of minor nobility, loyal to Cromwell's allies, she was neither powerful nor remarkable. But she had what mattered most: discretion. She could move through rooms unnoticed, collect words without being seen, and blend into sorrow when the Queen's world began to crumble. Cromwell didn't need a sword, he needed a shadow, and Margaret became his perfect creation. He told her, "Loyalty is your salvation." She believed it. Perhaps she even believed she was serving England itself, but Cromwell's loyalty was never to England. It was to control, to keep power where fear could reach it. Margaret's task was clear. Watch Anne, record her moods, her prayers, her tears. Note who she trusted, and most importantly, report what could be used to destroy her. She didn't yet know that by serving Cromwell, she was stepping into history's darkest chamber, the one where duty and guilt share the same face. Margaret Dymoke entered the Queen's household as if it were a sanctuary, but it was already a cage. Anne Boleyn's brilliance had turned to suspicion, her charm to exhaustion. The laughter that once echoed through the court now came wrapped in whispers. Margaret's new duty was simple in words, cruel in spirit: sleep within the Queen's chambers and watch everything. She shared the room where Anne prayed, wept, and woke from restless dreams. Margaret was the last person Anne saw before she closed her eyes, and the first she saw when the sun returned. Each sigh, each murmured word, was a line in Cromwell's invisible diary. Anne still tried to hold on to her grace, reading scripture aloud, reciting French poems to steady her nerves, pretending not to notice the coldness around her. To Margaret, she was both fascinating and tragic. The woman who had once enchanted a king now moved like someone rehearsing her own downfall. Margaret recorded it all: her tone, her trembling, her occasional laughter that broke too suddenly. She wrote that Anne spoke often of God's silence, of justice, of the thin line between sin and accusation. To Cromwell, these were not reflections. They were evidence. And yet, there were moments that disturbed Margaret. When Anne knelt in prayer, her voice broke in such pure faith that Margaret hesitated to write. For a brief second, the spy forgot the mission. She was just a woman listening to another woman's pain. But then she remembered Cromwell's warning: that pity was treason. She inked her quill again and continued the report. Night after night, the sound of the Queen's soft prayers filled the chamber. And beside her, Margaret learned to pray too, not for the Queen's life, but for her own absolution. They said Anne Boleyn had the temper of a storm, proud, cunning, impossible to tame. But from her cell, Margaret saw none of that. The queen no longer fought against the guards or demanded news from the court. She simply waited. And in that waiting, there was something unbreakable. Cromwell's men wanted her shattered. They needed Anne to confess, to destroy herself before the blade ever touched her neck. Each question, each false accusation was designed to twist her faith into madness, but Anne held fast. She denied every sin they crafted for her: adultery, incest, witchcraft, words too vile for the woman who once carried England's future in her womb. Margaret watched her in silence as the interrogations dragged on. She saw the Queen's lips tremble only when they spoke of her brother George, yet even then she refused to curse the king. "I am innocent," Anne whispered once, "but God sees all, and I trust him." It wasn't defiance, it was faith stripped bare, the kind that frightens tyrants. Margaret's reports grew colder, more precise. She wrote of Anne's calmness as if documenting an experiment. But something inside her had shifted. The spy was beginning to see what Cromwell could not, that Anne's strength came not from ambition, but from conviction. She had become a mirror of their cruelty, reflecting back their lies without ever speaking them aloud. Late one night, as Anne hummed softly to herself, Margaret felt the first fracture of guilt. The melody was a lullaby, the same one her own mother had sung when she was a child. For the first time, the spy's hand shook as she wrote. Cromwell demanded details. He wanted fear, regret, hysteria. But Margaret could only write the truth. The Queen does not cry, she only prays. In the stillness of that cell, Anne Boleyn stopped being a queen and became something far more dangerous, a woman unbroken by the weight of men's power. And Margaret, the watcher, found herself praying not for Anne's death, but for her forgiveness. Margaret never admitted it aloud, not even to herself. But there was a strange satisfaction in her position, to know secrets that even the king did not, to hold, within her ink-stained notes, the power to shape a queen's fate. That thrill was dangerous. It was the same intoxicating control that men like Cromwell lived for. In the beginning, Margaret convinced herself she was only doing her duty, but over time, she began to enjoy the quiet tension, the way Anne's smallest gesture could mean everything. When the Queen smiled, it was rebellion. When she prayed, it was surrender. And Margaret was the unseen judge, recording it all. Fear became her companion, but so did power. The two fed each other, creating a strange pleasure she couldn't name. To spy was to survive, but to understand another woman so completely, to live within her silence and suffering, felt like forbidden knowledge. Anne, of course, had no idea. She treated Margaret kindly, as she treated all her attendants. Once she even thanked her for her gentle patience. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept hearing those words, gentle patience, echoing through the dark. The woman she was betraying had called her kind, and yet, when Cromwell's messengers came, Margaret handed over her reports without trembling. Each one a piece of Anne's soul reduced to ink and parchment. Cromwell would read them, smile faintly, and say, "She is unraveling." Excellent. But Anne wasn't unraveling. Margaret was. Every confession she wrote became a wound that refused to close. And still, some dark part of her took pride in the perfection of her task. Fear had turned to fascination, and fascination to guilt. The spy who thought she served power had become addicted to it. Watching Anne suffer gave her a sense of purpose, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest sin of all. Because when the day came that Anne finally faced the scaffold, it wasn't hatred that filled Margaret's heart, it was envy. In her final days, Anne Boleyn stopped speaking of the court, of Henry, or of her enemies. She spoke only of God. The woman who had once fought kings now bowed her head in quiet acceptance. She asked for a small Bible and kept it close, tracing the verses with trembling fingers. Margaret watched her transform from a queen into a believer stripped of all pride. Anne's faith was not the desperate clinging of the condemned. It was calm, terrifyingly calm. She prayed for the king's soul, for her daughter Elizabeth's future, and even for those who had betrayed her. "I forgive them," she whispered once, "for they know not what they do." Margaret had written hundreds of lines for Cromwell by then, but none cut through her like those 6 words. Cromwell expected fear. He expected Anne to beg, to collapse under guilt that wasn't hers. Instead, she found a kind of holiness in surrender. It wasn't weakness, it was power that could not be touched by politics or swords. Margaret felt her loyalty splitting like glass. Every time Anne closed her eyes to pray, Margaret wondered if God was listening, and if he was, whether he could forgive spies. One morning, Anne called her closer. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. "Tell them I hold no malice," she said softly. Margaret nodded, but didn't answer. She could barely breathe. That single sentence would later appear in Cromwell's records, twisted into proof of guilt. The Queen shows signs of repentance, but that wasn't repentance. It was grace. When Anne received the message that her execution would be delayed by a day, she smiled faintly. "Then I have more time to make peace," she said. Margaret didn't write that part down. For the first time, she tore a page from her journal and burned it. She told herself it was mercy. But deep down, she knew it was confession. By the time the Tower bell tolled for Anne's execution, Margaret Dymoke was no longer the woman Cromwell had chosen. Something inside her had begun to erode, quietly, invisibly, like rust beneath gold. She had done her duty too well, and that was precisely what haunted her. Every word she'd written, every note she'd sent, had helped build the case that now condemned Anne. Yet when the Queen smiled at her on that final morning, there was no trace of anger, only serenity. That smile was unbearable, because it forgave what Margaret herself could not. She began to dream of Anne's eyes. Awake or asleep, she could see them, not pleading, not frightened, just knowing. Margaret tried to pray, but prayer offered no comfort. She confessed nothing to Cromwell, but he noticed the change. "Do not pity the condemned," he warned. "Pity blinds the useful." But Margaret was already blind, not from pity, but from guilt. The walls of the Tower, once her place of control, now felt like judgment itself. She heard Anne's voice in her head during the silence of the night. "I forgive them." When Cromwell summoned her for a final debriefing, she told him Anne had faced her death with grace. He looked displeased. "Grace," he said coldly, "is a mask for guilt." Margaret didn't reply. For the first time, she wanted to strike him, to make him feel even a fraction of the dread she'd carried. But she said nothing. She returned to her quarters, lay on her bed, and cried for the first time in years. That night, the spy broke, not with a scream, but with silence. The kind that lingers forever. The trial of Anne Boleyn was never about justice. It was theater, scripted, rehearsed, and performed for a single audience, Henry VIII. The verdict had been written long before the Queen entered the chamber. Every man who stood in judgment knew what his silence would buy: safety, titles, gold. Margaret sat in the gallery, veiled, her report already complete. She wasn't there to listen, she was there to confirm that the machine she'd helped build was working. And it was. Witnesses, coached and trembling, spoke their lies with trembling conviction. The crowd pretended to believe them. Only Anne refused to play her part. When she rose to speak in her defense, the hall fell into a hush that even power could not command. Her voice was clear, no trace of panic, only truth. "I do not say I am without fault," she said, "but I have never been unfaithful to my husband." She did not plead. She simply stated it, as if the words were too sacred to twist. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw the jurors hesitate, but Cromwell's cold gaze silenced doubt faster than a sword. The guilty verdict came like thunder, loud and final. As Anne was led away, she looked up briefly, her eyes sweeping the crowd. Margaret's heart stopped. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough for the spy to understand that Anne knew everything. Anne didn't curse her, she only nodded, a silent acknowledgement that history would remember both of them, one for dying with truth, the other for living without it. That evening, Cromwell sent for Margaret again. "She dies at dawn," he said flatly. "Make sure she stays calm." It was a command meant for a servant, but it sounded like a sentence. The morning Anne Boleyn died, London held its breath. Inside the Tower, time moved differently, slower, heavier, as if the walls themselves mourned. Margaret Dymoke stood nearby, her eyes fixed on the woman she had watched, studied, and betrayed. She had been ordered to remain close until the end, to observe even Anne's final breath. Anne dressed herself in dignity. She chose a dark gown and tucked her hair neatly beneath her hood. "I pray God save the king," she murmured to no one in particular. The French executioner had been brought secretly to ensure a clean death, swift, silent, merciful. But mercy in the Tower was never free. Margaret followed a few paces behind as Anne walked toward the scaffold. There was no trembling, no tears. The crowd that gathered expected a spectacle, a broken queen, but what they saw was serenity. Anne knelt, whispering her last prayer, and for a moment, Margaret believed she saw light around her, not divine perhaps, but human, unyielding. The sword flashed once. The sound that followed was not a scream, but silence. A silence so complete it seemed to devour everything. Margaret felt it in her bones, the moment where history turned from heartbeat to echo. She didn't cry, she didn't move. She simply stood there, the perfect witness Cromwell had made her. But inside, something tore loose. She wanted to scream, to confess, to run from the Tower and never look back. Instead, she watched as the executioner lifted the lifeless head and declared, "Justice served." That night, Margaret lay awake, waiting for guilt to come. But it didn't. Instead, she felt a strange calm. Cold, numbing, almost pleasurable. The same calm Cromwell had described years ago when teaching her to silence her conscience. She told herself Anne's death had meaning, that it preserved order, saved England, secured the future, but deep inside, she knew it was a lie. The only thing preserved that morning was fear, and Margaret, the spy who had watched the Queen die, would carry that silence longer than anyone else alive. The Tower fell silent after Anne's death. London returned to its noise, its markets, its prayers, pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. But for Margaret Dymoke, silence became a way of life. She left the Tower not as a hero or villain, but as something far more tragic, a woman who had learned to live without her soul. Cromwell praised her efficiency, rewarded her with favor, and dismissed her from further duty. He never asked what she thought of the execution. He didn't need to. Spies weren't meant to think, only to report, to obey, and to forget. But Margaret did remember. Every whisper in the Tower, every prayer Anne had spoken in the darkness, every tremor in her own heart as she watched innocence destroyed, it stayed with her. And yet, somehow, she slept. Not peacefully, but completely. Night after night she drifted into deep, dreamless rest. It was her body's betrayal, the one mercy she didn't ask for. Sleep became her escape from memory, her only form of confession. She couldn't speak the truth, not in Henry's England, where truth itself was treason. So, she slept soundly for 40 years, while the world forgot the queen she watched die and remembered only the lies she helped preserve. In her sleep, she found the peace she had denied another woman and the quiet comfort of knowing that history someday might wake up. Years passed. Kings fell, queens replaced one another, and the Tower grew quieter. Thomas Cromwell himself met the same cold justice he had once dealt to others. The sword he'd ordered for Anne Boleyn now kissed his own neck. But Margaret Dymoke lived on, untouched, her silence her shield. Yet silence doesn't mean peace. It only means that guilt has learned how to whisper. Every time Margaret heard church bells toll, she thought of that single, ringing moment when Anne's head fell. Every time she touched her rosary, she saw Anne's fingers clutching the cross in her final prayer. The memory never shouted, it just lingered, patient, steady, unforgiving. She grew older, more invisible, younger courtiers forgot her name. But the ghost of Anne Boleyn did not. It lived inside her conscience, not as a haunting, but as a question she could never answer. Was obedience worth a queen's soul? She told herself that she'd been powerless, a servant following orders, but deep down, she knew she had choices. She could have written differently. She could have refused to watch. She could have spoken one word of truth before the sword fell. Late at night, she would wake gasping, her throat dry, certain she could hear Anne's calm voice saying the same words from her cell, "God knows my innocence." Margaret would whisper back, trembling, "And he knows my guilt." History would forget her name for centuries. But her silence remained, a monument to every witness who chose safety over truth. When Margaret Dymoke died, she left behind no confession, no memoir, no tearful apology. Only the reports, the same 19 days of written observations she'd sent to Sir William Kingston under Cromwell's command. Neat, measured, obedient. But between the lines, history would later find something extraordinary, a quiet rebellion. Centuries later, historians uncovered those records in the National Archives, preserved in brittle ink and fading parchment. At first glance, they seemed simple: a spy's notes, a servant's duty. Yet, when read closely, they told a different story, one Anne herself could never speak. Margaret had not lied, she hadn't dared. But she had chosen what to record, and how. She captured Anne's prayers in full detail. She wrote of her kindness toward her jailers, her devotion to her daughter Elizabeth, her serenity in the face of death. She documented Anne's words, "I have not wronged the king," and her final oath before taking communion. Cromwell had ordered her to find guilt. Instead, she had preserved innocence. Line by line, Margaret had created a testimony that contradicted the Tudor machine itself. A spy turned witness. A report turned resistance. Those papers became the first honest record of Anne Boleyn's final days, unpolished, unpolitical, and painfully human. They proved that history doesn't always need heroes. Sometimes it needs scribes who dare to write what they truly see. Margaret Dymoke never spoke the truth aloud, but her ink did, and centuries later her silent rebellion became Anne Boleyn's vindication. Margaret Dymoke was buried quietly, without ceremony, without legacy. No one at her funeral spoke her name with awe or anger. She was simply another court widow who had outlived her king and her secrets. Yet beneath the calm of her gravestone lay a truth too heavy for confession, the truth she'd carried like a stone in her chest for 40 years. In her final days, those who tended to her said she often prayed in silence, lips moving but no sound escaping. Some thought she was senile. Others believed she was repenting. Maybe both were true. Maybe she was still speaking to the woman she'd watched die, the queen who had smiled at her even after learning that Margaret was there to spy. Anne Boleyn's name became legend. Her daughter Elizabeth became one of England's greatest monarchs. But Margaret remained a shadow, the woman who listened, wrote, and endured. Her peace wasn't earned through justice or redemption, but through acceptance that truth, once witnessed, cannot be erased. When her reports resurfaced centuries later, her voice returned, not as a confession, but as proof that even in the darkest corners of power, someone had seen the injustice and quietly written it down. Perhaps that was her final rest, not in the earth, but in history's awakening, because in the end, Margaret Dymoke didn't need forgiveness. She needed to be remembered, not as a spy or traitor, but as the only witness brave enough to watch a queen die, feel compassion, and still survive to tell it in silence. In the echoing halls of history, truth often survives in whispers, not in crowns or swords, but in the quiet ink of those who dared to see. Margaret Dymoke was no heroine, no villain, just a witness who learned that silence can both protect and condemn. Yet through her pen, Anne Boleyn's innocence endured long after both their voices were gone. 5 centuries later, we still read her words and feel the heartbeat of a conscience caught between duty and mercy. If history moves you, subscribe, because every forgotten soul deserves to be remembered.